الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن سيدنا ونبينا محمدا عبده ورسوله. قال الله تبارك وتعالى في القرآن المجيد بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم أولم نعمركم ما يتذكر فيه من تذكر. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين الحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم. In the prior two khutbahs, we had touched upon a topic that I wish to conclude today, and that was pertaining to the effect that our personal devices, and in particular the time that we spend on screens, has had on our lives. And in the first khutbah, we in particular spoke about how our free time will be asked about by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And while we didn't have, historically, our complaint would always be that we never had enough time. We were somehow unable to incorporate 3 or 4 hours of screen time into our lives over the course of the last 10 years or so, which was unfathomable before. And we talked about how that has sucked away so much opportunity for us to advance ourselves in so many ways in our lives. And then last week we talked about how, as Muslims, we're very particular, rightfully so, to stand up for just causes and to speak out against oppression. And while we've done so in many facets of this world, including when we see oppression, for instance, in the lives of people in the Muslim world, we've neglected to stand up to oppression when it comes to companies and organizations that are working towards sucking out our time, meaning essentially organizations that are designed and structured to attract our attention towards screens and the multi-billion-dollar investments that go into this. So today I'm going to conclude with this sort of theme, and I thought I would just highlight 3 practical things that we can do in our lives that we take from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ that will help us shift our attention away from our devices that have taken so much away from us. The first is that we should be very particular about creating times or spaces in our life where we are without our devices. We should be very particular about creating time and space in our lives where we are completely without our devices. This is very important. And there's a couple, every individual needs to decide what that time is for them, right? But there are a couple of things that certainly come to mind. For instance, we could set a rule in our home that at the time of dinner or at the dinner table, we will not pull out our devices. They have to be in a separate room altogether, because that's the time where we're going to interact with one another. We could have a rule that if I'm sitting with, for instance, my parent, or I'm sitting with my wife or my husband, and I'm interacting with them, that during those times, maybe that interaction or that conversation that I have, I'm going to be putting away my device completely, because that's the only way to have a meaningful interaction. And it's interesting because one of the causes of strife in families today is the inability for people to give attention to one another. And that's a separate discussion, but it ties into this, so I'm not going to go into detail there. But if we look at the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, we see very clearly that when he was in the presence of another person, or he was having some interaction with that individual, he would give 100% of his attention toward them. And in the Shama'il of Imam Tirmidhi, the Prophet ﷺ is described as someone who is iltafata ma'an. That when someone would be with him, they would actually physically be with him. Meaning the Prophet ﷺ would essentially turn his physical body toward the person he was interacting with. Now put that into perspective in our own lives, right? That while we're speaking with our spouse or while we're speaking with, our children, midway through the conversation we're interrupted, we're checking our screens, we're having 2 or 3 conversations simultaneously, or giving our attention to 2 or 3 other things while we're supposed to be giving, according to the Sunnah, our full attention to the person in front of us. And this is a very common complaint that we hear about within the house. The inability for people to communicate with one another without interruption. So a simple step is that we make a rule that maybe it's in the kitchen or in the living room, no devices are allowed, right? So we create a space and we have a rule within our home. Or maybe it's a time where we say between the hours of 6 and 8 o'clock in the evening, that's the time where I will keep myself device free, and everyone in the house has to follow those rules. So that in that, maybe that evening hour is when we tend to be with one another, right? That evening hour is when we have dinner, maybe we have tea, maybe we play sports, whatever it may be. But we create a rule within the home in which we make ourselves device-free for a period of time. The second practical advice is that we should invest in physical setups for screen time. Stationary setups, let's put it that way. What I mean, and this particular applies to children. Historically, if a person wanted to spend time on a screen, or wanted to spend it, they had to go to a particular room and sit in front of a particular device, and they would have to watch from there. And then when it was time to move away, they would walk away from that area, and they wouldn't have a device with them. They couldn't stare, all they could see were things in front of them. But what's happened now with the advent of mobility, and of course it has its benefits, is that we are able to access our screens from wherever we may be. We could be driving, we can be staring at a screen. We could be at the park, we have a screen in front of us. We could be at home at dinner talking to our children, and we can have a screen next to us. Now, it's important for us as adults to think about this a bit, but in particular for children, and let's say that we decide as a family that we need to let them have a bit of screen time, they need to watch something or they need to do this or that, then we should invest in a physical setup for them. It's common today for children now to be given, for instance, smartphones in their hands or iPads in their laps, and they take it wherever they go, into a room, in the car, and there's so many issues that arise from this, including posture, including distance of vision, etc. If we should invest in a physical setup, if that's what's necessary. And if our children have to spend time in front of a screen, they have to go to a particular location, spend time in front of that screen where everyone can kind of observe, and then when it's done, it's time to walk away, they're no longer able to access that screen. It's not that they're able to constantly be sucked into something for an extended period of time. That applies for adults as well, right? Meaning, for instance, the option of doing work on a desktop is far superior than doing something on our phone, for many reasons. So that's practical tip number 2, is that we should remove the complete mobility that we've allowed to arise in our lives, and we should make things, again, go back and take a step back and make things more stationary, and we'll see the benefit that comes from it. We create a separation. A believer, the only thing they should have with them at all times is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? But if I have my mobile device with me all the time, then I become more dependent and reliant on it than I am on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The third practical tip is that we should, as individuals and as families, we should spend more time in nature. We should spend more time in nature. And the reason for this and how it ties in is, look, we've become so amazed at these screens such that we have a very hard time coming off of it. We've spoken about the addiction before. But if we were to just look and put our screens down for a bit, and we were to look at the incredible creation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put around us, we would be more mesmerized by it than what we see on our screens. But it requires us to actually get out and spend time in nature. Many places in the Quran, Allah Ta'ala instructs us and advises us to look and explore and to reflect upon His creation. Right? قُلْ سِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَانظُرُوا. He tells us directly to look. وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا وَالْقَمَرِ إِذَا تَلَاهَا وَالنَّهَارِ إِذَا جَلَّاهَا. He swears by these things, which essentially encourage for us reflection, meaning the sun and how it وَالشَّمْسِ وَضُحَاهَا, the sun and how its morning light shines. وَالْقَمَرِ إِذَا تَلَاهَا, and the moon and how it follows it. If we were to actually reflect upon what needs to occur for a sunrise to occur every morning, we would be mesmerized. We could care less what was on our screens because the greatest show in the universe was occurring before our very eyes every morning at 6 o'clock. Right? If we were to reflect when it was raining, for instance, what it requires for rain to descend down upon a land, we would be mesmerized by it. If we were to walk and take a hike into the mountains and see what would be required to establish these giant masses of bodies of mass, and the ability for these things to peg down the earth that we live upon, we would be lost in this. But it requires us to actually spend time in nature to give ourselves the ability to reflect upon this. So that may mean that we have to either establish hobbies for ourselves or create trips for our families where we do things that are out in nature away from technology. So that could mean fishing, for instance. It could mean getting into hiking. It could be in winter sports. It could be stargazing. opportunities for us to reflect upon Allah subhanahu, to see Allah's creation, which will then naturally allow us to reflect upon His creation. So that we're no longer be so encapsulated or so mesmerized by these by the false technologies that have just taken so much of our attention, but rather we're able to implement what the Quran has taught us. And we're able to really nourish our lives and ourselves with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created. So these are 3 practical things that we can do. Number 1, to summarize, is that we should have periods of time or spaces within our home that are completely device-free, and everyone in the home should be required to follow that rule. Number 2, that we should invest in physical stationary spaces for screen time so that we're not always having access to it, especially for our children, in a mobile fashion. And the third is that we should spend time looking and exploring, and we should spend time exploring the world and spending time in nature, and in particular establishing hobbies in our lives that allow us to see what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created. And I'll conclude with this final verse of the Prophet's verse of the Quran that sort of closes this whole discussion, right? And that is that our time is valuable. And by default, as Allah mentioned in the Quran, وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ. At default, by time, we are at a loss. Meaning the clock is just ticking and it's just decreasing in this direction as our lives go by. So human beings are at a loss as it is. How is it that we're going to allow other things to now take that time away from us, especially things that are not necessarily even beneficial for us? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks a question in the Quran. It's a rhetorical question. And He says, أَوَلَمْ نُعَمِّرْكُمْ مَا يَتَذَكَّرُ فِيهِ مَنْ تَذَكَّرَ. Have we not given, nu'ammir means, ammara yu'ammiru, means to give or prolong one's life. Meaning, أَوَلَمْ نُعَمِّرْكُمْ, have we not given you enough life? مَا يَتَذَكَّرُ فِيهِ مَنْ تَذَكَّرَ. So that you could reflect, for the people so that those who wanted to be mindful could be mindful. Have we not given you enough time so that you could do this? Meaning, although we're at a loss, Allah Ta'ala has prolonged our lives so that we can use it maximally. So we should be very mindful of how we spend our time, and in particular, be mindful of those things that have taken time away from us. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us the tawfiq to be particular about where we spend our time and where we invest our energy. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to be mindful of those things in the world that create and cause oppression, be it physical, social, or mental oppression. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to inculcate the teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanallah al-azim. Aqulu qawli hadha wa astaghfirullah li wa lakum wa li sa'iril muslimina fastaghfiruhu innahu huwal ghafurur rahim. الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن سيدنا ونبينا محمدا عبده ورسوله. قال الله تبارك وتعالى في القرآن المجيد: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم، إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم، وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم: أرحم أمتي بأمتي أبو بكر، وأشدهم في أمر الله عمر، وأصدقهم حياء عثمان، وأقضاهم علي، وفاطمة سيدة نساء أهل الجنة، والحسن والحسين سيدا شباب أهل الجنة، وحمزة أسد الله وأسد رسوله. اللهم اغفر للعباس وولده مغفرة ظاهرة وباطنة لا تغادر ذنبا، رضوان الله تعالى عليهم أجمعين. اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين، اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين، اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين، اللهم انصر الإسلام والمسلمين، اللهم انصر الإسلام والمسلمين، اللهم انصر المسلمين في كل مكان. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون. عباد الله اتقوا الله واذكروا الله يذكركم وادعوه يستجب لكم ولذكر الله تعالى أكبر والله يعلم ما